Today's story will be about a roommate from basically hell. But before that, if you enjoy creepy and eerie stories told face to face, then you're at the right place. Make sure you leave a subscribe with the bell notifications on so you can never miss a video and you're always here on time. When George was 21 years old, he transferred to a college in San Francisco. Now, he had to look for a place to stay, and he chose Craigslist at the time. He found a place that was close to his campus, and it was an affordable price, 2 bedrooms. It just seemed like a good deal. The girl who lived there was 29 years old, and her name was Tiffany. She was very tall and white. She had jet black hair, just super dark. At the same time, she would have this super white makeup on her, which would make her hair look even more black, and her eyes would even seem black even though they were brown. She always wore this peculiar old-fashioned locket around her neck, which was somewhat big, but other than her heavy metal style, she seemed like a really nice person and liked the way George was talking and acting. They seemed like a good fit. She accepted George to move in with her, so George decided, yeah, let me just move in with her. It didn't take long, though, to realize that there was something off, something secretive about Tiffany that George hadn't noticed when they first met. His first night, when he moved in there, they went out for a pizza. It was late at night. We're at this really small pizza place and eating their pizzas. And then, out of the blue, Tiffany just started giggling. Literally everybody in the restaurant just stares at her because she's giggling in this really high-pitched noise. And George just looks up from his pizza to see what was going on, if there was something funny, because he didn't say anything. And then Tiffany suggested that George looked like Shia LaBeouf. George was like, sorry? And then she repeated, she said that he literally looked like Shia LaBeouf, and it was so cool. Now, George, he didn't look anything like Shia LaBeouf. He was blonde. He was a much more taller and thicker dude. So he thinks to himself, I don't really look anything like him, but still he doesn't really want to throw off Tiffany, so he says, thanks, I guess. And Tiffany continues to giggle. But that wasn't all. George, he realized that Tiffany was constantly staring at him when he was not looking. When he was taking a bite from his pizza, or when he was looking at his phone to check something, he could see with the corner of his eyes Tiffany was just staring at him. So when he would finally look at her, he would catch this blank sort of face, this emotionless awe, and almost like a worshipping kind of look. She would be just mesmerized looking at him. But once their eyes met, once she realized that George is looking at her, she would immediately start giggling and looking somewhere else as though she wasn't really looking. He felt quite disturbed by this. He didn't really want to look away because he knew she would be looking at her, but at the same time he didn't want to make eye contact because it felt so weird. He just finished his pizza and they went back home, which is where things got even weirder. When they got back home from pizza, Tiffany suggested she show her room to George. George wasn't really interested in seeing her room, but he didn't want to be a party pooper. So he reluctantly said, yeah, sure. And Tiffany took him to her room. That's when things took a turn from being weird to more terrifying. George just follows Tiffany to her room, which is very close to his own room. They're walking in the hall. It's a very narrow hall. And she opens the door. The lights are already turned on. And once he enters the room, he can't stop staring at the walls because everywhere are posters of Shia LaBeouf. Just pictures of him all over the walls, even on the mirrors. He looks in the corner of the room and he sees these movies stacked on top of each other, DVDs of Shia LaBeouf. On her desk, there's just pictures in these frames of Shia LaBeouf. George obviously realized that, yeah, she was obsessed with this actor. She was probably in love with this actor. But then he realized something that disturbed him even further. There were pictures of Shia LaBeouf, but the face was altered, almost badly photoshopped, and on top of them was George's face. When did she find the time to find the pictures of George to put on Shia LaBeouf's face? On her desk was this kind of small photograph printer. So George thought to himself, she was able to print out his own picture immediately from her own computer, which is why it was already on Shia LaBeouf's face. George felt insanely disturbed. He didn't really know what to say or what to do. He looked at Tiffany, and Tiffany was just in the corner looking at George, kind of giggling still, and it disturbed him immensely. Now, the rent was cheap, and it was close to his campus, and he didn't really want to go look for a new place right now. And if it was just photos of him on Shia LaBeouf's face, he didn't mind too much. So he didn't say anything about it. A few weeks passed by, and once George's classes start, he's rarely at home anymore. So he would come very late, and on the days he doesn't go to school, she would go to work, so they would rarely meet at that point. Even on the weekends when they were both at home, Tiffany would rarely leave her room. She would spend the entire day and even night there, only coming out to maybe grab a snack or eat something real quick and then just go back to her room. She would lock it because George would hear her lock the door. Then he would listen to these high-pitched laughs of her. It would sometimes last the entire night. She would have these giggles. George would even hear her talk to someone even though she was alone. So George thought she was maybe talking to herself, which was acceptable because many people talk to themselves when they were alone. But the way she was talking was still disturbing because she would say something and then immediately start giggling. One time George went to her door and kind of tried to eavesdrop. That's when he realized Tiffany was not talking to anybody really. She was just saying, "How are you today?" And then she would start giggling immediately. Some nights that she wouldn't sleep and would only giggle or talk to herself were uncomfortable for George, but he wouldn't really mind as long as he wasn't talking to her or having too much to do with her. He was fine. On very few occasions, she would come out of her room into the living room where George would spend most of his time because there was a TV and he'd watch it, and she would just talk to him, but she would mostly slur her words and have difficulty talking, so George assumed she was drinking a lot as well. Sometimes, however, she would come out of her room without really making any noise at all, and George would only notice her after a while had passed. He would turn and see her just standing in the hallway, almost hidden behind the wall, just half of her face visible, watching George sit and watch something there. And when he realized that she was there, he would try to be friendly and say, "Oh, hey, Tiffany." Tiffany would have this really long and awkward pause, and then she would just have this high-pitched giggle again, and immediately she would disappear in the hall, go back to her room and lock it. And this was quite disturbing for George. He would just get the chills when this happened, and this was something that started to happen more frequently as more days and weeks passed. It became a habit to George to just constantly check on the hall whether someone was there or not. He would sometimes even imagine Tiffany standing there with the corner of his eye, and when he would look, realizing that nobody was really there, he would think to himself, was she actually there and she just ran away as I was turning my head? It became very uncomfortable for him to just sit and watch TV, so he stopped altogether. One night he woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of what he thought was the front door being unlocked. He got out of his bed and got out of his room. The lights were completely off, but he could make out in the dark a shape that someone was in front of the front door, just locking and unlocking the door. When he looked closer, it was Tiffany, this big figure, and her hair was turned towards him, so he wasn't really able to see her face. He wasn't sure whether she was awake or just sleepwalking. She was constantly turning the lock, locking it, and then unlocking it back. And for some reason, she was murmuring the same words over and over again. And these were the words that disturbed George like he'd never felt before. She was constantly saying George Barker, over and over again. She was repeating his name. He didn't really know what to make of this. He wasn't sure what it is that she was trying to accomplish, whether she was sleepwalking, whatever she was dreaming of. Why was she at the front door trying to lock and unlock it? It gave him quite the goosebumps, and he just slowly walked back to his room, closed the door. Unfortunately for him, though, he wasn't able to lock the door because the lock was broken. From the first day that he moved in, Tiffany had told him that it wasn't able to lock from inside or outside, so he couldn't really lock the door. He just closed it and went back to bed. He tried to sleep, but he couldn't. The entire night he was just hearing the front door being locked and unlocked again. At some point, a few hours later, it ended, and he heard what sounded like this person from in front of his door almost dragging their feet. It must have been Tiffany just sleepwalking back to her own room, and when he heard the door shut, he was at least able to get a few hours of sleep. A few days pass. Everything goes back to normal. Nothing really out of the ordinary happening. George is still having a hard time sleeping because he can't really unshake the feeling of being constantly watched by Tiffany. But still, he's able to move on from whatever had happened that night. So this one day, Tiffany doesn't come back home from work. So he thinks, great, Tiffany is out today. And he decides to watch a movie in the living room. He goes to the living room, he turns on the movie, and he's watching it when an hour passes by and he hears the front door being unlocked and he can hear someone walking towards the living room. He looks up and he sees Tiffany standing there, and she's super angry. She's just shaking. Her face is entirely red. Something had happened. George kind of pauses the movie because he knows she's not gonna leave. She walks into the living room really angry. In front of the TV, she stops. She turns on the lights and she says, "Do you want to hear about my ex-boyfriend?" Now, George, he doesn't really want to hear about her ex-boyfriend, but she seemed so angry, he agreed and he said, "Yeah, sure." 10 minutes into her story, she's so riled up, she started screaming and yelling and almost pushing things off the table, ready to just break something. She's so angry. She's jolting in the room, yelling at things, hitting the wall, and George is just sitting on the couch, literally is hoping that the neighbors call on the cops and the cops come and save him from this weird and scary situation. Unfortunately for him, no cops are showing up, even though she's screaming her lungs out, and George is just trying to tell her to just calm down and not yell that much because the neighbors would be disturbed, but she's not listening. She's just screaming, continuing to tell about their breakup. And there was this one sentence that awoke George from his kind of passive listening, this autopilot. He wasn't really hearing her words anymore. He was just nodding his head and hearing the screams. But that one sentence had awoken him and made him stood up for a second and realize what this girl was capable of. He didn't know her at all. He wasn't sure what she could do. "I'll slit his throat. I will literally kill him." This is what she had said. She was so angry when she was saying those words. George knew she meant it. It wasn't just words that had come out of her mouth out of randomness or out of anger. She had thought about this. She wanted to do this. A few more minutes pass by when she tells the story, and then she stops and kind of starts giggling. Her voice turns back to normal, and she thanks George for listening to her story. She continues on to giggle as she leaves the living room and goes back to her room. George, he felt more disturbed this time, not just because she had that manic kind of outburst, but something about her story and the way she ended it, the way she started giggling with this almost sinister, plotting way, had made him feel uneasy. This time he felt not just uncomfortable, he felt unsafe in that house. Now, because he felt that way, he just turned off the movie, went back to his room. He wanted to sleep and shake it all off. But at the same time, he remembered he can't really lock his door. He wasn't gonna sleep with an unlocked door with that crazy person, he thought, next door. So he tried and pushed the edge of his dresser in front of the door to act as a barrier. So he felt a bit safer and went to bed. And then he woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of his dresser scraping against the floor. Tiffany was on the other side, trying to push open the door. He immediately got up, turned on the lights, and started shouting at her to stop pushing the door. He could see from that little bit of opening that Tiffany was literally drunk. She was shaking uncontrollably, and in her eyes was this insane look. Her locket was now open, And inside was what seemed to be this black and white picture of George. He wasn't quite certain, but that's what he could make out. So he kept shouting at her to just stop and go back to her own room, but she wasn't listening. She wasn't really focusing on anything. She wasn't even looking at George. She was just trying to open the door, pushing her body against it. He counteracted. He just went behind his dresser and pushed it even further towards the door and closed it shut. That's when he heard Tiffany go back to her room and the door close and the locks locked. So he knew she was back in her room. But still, he could not sleep that night. He just sat in front of the dresser in case she would come back. The next morning, he went back out of his room. He double checked if Tiffany was around, nothing, but then his heart dropped. On the ground, in the hallway in front of his room, was a knife. He felt this instant goosebumps all over his arms. He had this image of last night Tiffany pushing against the door. She was holding a knife while she was doing so. All he could think of in that moment was those words that Tiffany was repeating, that she would slit the guy's throat, that she would kill her ex. Once he realized this, he immediately could tell what was about to happen last night if he hadn't pushed the dresser in front of his door. He took the knife and went to her room. He knocked. He heard the lock turn twice, and Tiffany opened the door, looking with this emotionless face. Her makeup still was not put on yet, so she had a much more pale face than when she would put on makeup, and he confronted her about it. He said, "What is this knife? And you came to my room last night." And she said she didn't remember any of that. She didn't come to his room last night. She doesn't even remember telling him about her ex. And while she was saying these, her eyes were almost staring blank, looking at nothing. She wasn't looking straight at George. She was looking in this emptiness. After that night, George, it was enough for him. He decided to immediately move out, even if he had to sleep on the streets for a couple of nights. Luckily for him, he found another apartment with his friend and he moved in immediately. His lease was month to month, so he wasn't gonna lose out on anything. But after he had moved out, that wasn't the end of the story for him. About a month after he had moved out, he went to the movies and he turned off his phone. When he left the movies and he turned on his phone again, he had 40 messages. All of them came from the same number. He immediately realized who it was. It was Tiffany. And the messages ranged from, "Hey, how are you?" to "I hate your guts. I hope you die," or back to "I miss you. Let's meet sometime. Want to go out for pizza?" It was insane. The messages didn't make sense, and they were just random emotions all over the place. Now that George lives with his friend, he feels much safer, but sometimes he can still hear the high-pitched giggles at night. He knows it's his imagination or just the thought that he had listened to it for so long, but he still can't help feel creeped out by it every now and then. And when he thinks back to that night where he had moved the dresser in front of the room, he wonders if he hadn't done it, what would have happened? Or if he hadn't woken up to push back against the dresser, and if Tiffany was able to open the door, even against the dresser. He thinks that he might not actually have been alive today. But that's the end of our story for today. Have you had a similar experience, or did you have a difficult roommate ever in your life? You can tell me about it in the comments, or send me an email and maybe we'll be able to share the story in the future. Also, what do you think about George's story? Do you think he should have moved out maybe a bit earlier, and when he realized those creepy photos on her wall, maybe he waited a bit too long and he pushed his luck? But then again, it was smart to push the dresser against the door, wasn't it? Either way, he's alive today. Now, there are stories about roommates where it's not so much of a happy ending, I would say, and that have had much worse consequences. I'll hopefully be talking about it in our next session, maybe a part 2 of Hellish Roommates. But until then, stay safe and stay eerie.
Tried to walk home last night, really thought I'd be fine, but then a sudden thump behind. Wait, is that an alien? What was that sound I heard? Jane, please stop fooling around. What do you mean wash the dishes? Do you realize what time it is? I'm getting the creeps again. Look at these goosebumps on my skin. If I'm not back by 8, the delivery guy probably did it. Now I must fade in the dark, get away from everyone. Oh Jane, I'm so afraid. I'm begging you to stay. Is someone watching me as I'm wide asleep? Getting those goosebumps again. Wait, am I peeing? I'm so scared that I'm peeing.